Geoff's going to talk to Amanda about money.
Well, thank you, Victoria. Well, yes, one of the things I've been doing over the past couple of weeks is reading a very big book called The Creature from Jekyll Island by the American author Edwin Griffin. 600-page book, very fascinating, about the history of money and how it's brought about wars and massive inflation, and it covering a very wide range of the history of money, and perhaps it's something we can talk about on another show. But reading this book reminded me of, made me think about my friend Amanda Vickers, because a while ago I actually heard a presentation from Amanda on the subject of what she referred to as sovereign money. So I'm curious to find out a bit more about this sovereign money. Is it anything to do with what I read about in this book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which was about the Federal Reserve and so on? So welcome, Amanda. Thank you very much for coming in today. So tell me, what is sovereign money? What actually is it?
Oh, hi, Geoff. Thank you, and thanks for having me. So, sovereign money is basically money issued by the sovereign, which is the state, and that is the right of an independent sovereign country to do that. And it needs to be distinguished because at the moment 98% of the money in the economy is not what we call sovereign money. It's issued by banks and it's called debt-backed money. So that requires a bit of an explanation, which I'm sure we'll get to, but effectively sovereign money is a much healthier way to run an economy because it doesn't have the debt behind it, and essentially the government has more control over the economy and inflation.
So have we ever had that in this country, in New Zealand? Have we ever had sovereign money?
Well, look, we've got it now, Geoff, because at the moment the government issues all our notes and coins, which of course is government-issued sovereign money, and they have the right to do that. The Reserve Bank goes ahead and prints that money, but the electronic portion of our money is not issued by the government. So that's all the ones and zeros in computers, so that's everything in every bank account anywhere. So it's not tangible, and it is backed by debt. And so the sovereign money part of it is really only issued by the government.
Okay, so would you be referring to, for instance, when a person takes out a mortgage, they go to a bank and they've got the deposit to buy a house, and the bank then credits their account with the mortgage. So this is the...
And that's exactly what it is, yeah. So the bank...
And it's not sovereign money.
That is not sovereign money, and most of our money is not sovereign money. So I just want to talk about how that came about. So we took the British system with us here, and I know, Geoff, you've been reading about the Jekyll Island, the whole about the Federal Reserve in America, which is a very different story, but we were a British colony for a long time, so we brought that system here. Now, in 1844, they put through an act that said that the banks can't issue their own banknotes, which they were doing, but back then you didn't have electronic money. So what they did was they got their ledger sheets. So when somebody went for a mortgage, they'd write, our asset is a loan to you, so here's $100,000, and then the person would owe $100,000, and that was their liability. So technically the balance sheet added up to zero, and they got away with doing that because the Bank Charter Act of 1844 didn't say you couldn't do it. And actually really what's happened is that's just never been updated, but that's sort of the system we use now. So yes, you get the mortgage and debt is created with the money. And I just want to point out that it's a little bit different to the system that everybody thinks happens, which is the fractional reserve model, which isn't actually entirely correct. And that's backed by the Bank of England and the International Monetary Fund, who are all saying no. What happens is the loan comes first and then the bank looks for the corresponding deposits.
So can you just explain this fractional reserve?
Well, I will, but remember it's not actually really the system that is
Okay.
in place at the moment, but it's very similar to the system that is in place, which means that the bank has what's called a capital reserves, and through there, I want to make this really simple, Geoff, actually. So there's capital
Sure.
ratios, so they can lend a certain amount of money over and above what the bank's assets is, and that's their capital ratio, and that's set by the banking authorities according to the Basel Accords. I mean, that's quite detailed stuff. So say the bank owns $10,000, well, they might be able to lend another $90,000 so Geoff Mills can get a mortgage tomorrow to buy a house. So that's how it works, and then their balance sheet balances out. So they give you the loan, and then they look for the deposit so that their balance sheets work out. So just forget fractional reserve banking for the moment, it's not right. And in fact, that's why the textbooks today are actually talking about how the banks need deposits first and then they loan that. That's sort of come about through the fractional reserve model, which again has been totally, the Bank of England has basically said that's an incorrect description of the
Okay.
way banking works today.
Okay. So you've mentioned on Facebook, I've seen some references to Iceland. Is that anything to do with sovereign money? What is happening in Iceland, where they have put bankers in prison for what happened in 2008? Is that anything to do with sovereign money?
Well, not really. I mean, sovereign money, the banking system, I mean, is technically legal. I think what they're saying in Iceland is that the bank has acted irresponsibly, and I think this is all this part of this global neoliberal movement that the private banks, and in fact all private corporations, they just want the ability to do what they want, how they want, without regulation. So they're busy taking all their bankers to court. No, really, there's a movement in Switzerland to look at a sovereign money model, and they're, I believe, one of the most democratic societies in the world. So they've got a huge public referendum going about whether they are going to adopt a system where only the government issues the money, and all the pros and cons for and against that. And
Amanda, just to confirm, is what you're saying is that basically how we think money works is not how it works, and there's a lot more flexibility in the system than people, there's a lot more different ways of the system being than people imagine.
absolutely, it doesn't work the way people think it works, and that's a really important point, Victoria. So we'll come to that as well.
Now, look, Amanda, about sovereign money, what would you say is actually wrong, in simple terms, what is wrong with our present system of money in New Zealand?
Well, look, there's two parts of money. There's the money issued by the government, and there's the money issued by the private banks. And then there's the public and the private debt. Now, this is the way I see it, Geoff. We are a sovereign nation, and the government's mandate is to ensure that there is enough money in our economy for it to run efficiently, effectively, within inflationary limits. And the government, it is claimed by the organisations who espouse sovereign money systems such as positive money. They say, there's going to be much more control over the economy if you can not only control the price of money, which they do now, and is regarded as a blunt instrument, but also the amount of money in the economy. But let's just take New Zealand's public debt, because that's the most obvious and the most important part to consider here. So before the crash in 2008, our public debt was 10 billion, now it's 77 billion. So that's what the government owes. Now, where does the government get that money? The majority of that is borrowed from the private banks, put into the economy for whatever reason, and we pay interest on it. And that at the moment, as we all heard loud and clear at the last election, is $10 million a day, or about $3 to $4 billion a year in interest. Now, why are we allowing the private banks to give us money and then us taxpayers pay interest back on it. I mean, that's called economic rent. That's called renting our own money supply off the banks. That's an enormous amount of money, and no banking organisation or nobody's come up with a really legitimate good reason why on earth we'd do that. And my answer, Geoff, and this is a whole nother conversation, is vested interests and expected social narrative about what you do, and this whole big thing of, oh, you're printing money, that's evil, when really we're doing exactly the same thing as the banks are doing now. We would just be putting needed money into the economy. It's all the way you look at it. And that is why I get so passionate about this topic, because that is such an extraordinary large amount of money taxpayers are funding, and we're getting as a country into debt over that.
Okay, so therefore, if I'm hearing you right, what's happening at the moment is that the banks are creating money out of thin air and lending it to the government, and the government is paying interest on that, whereas the government itself could produce money out of thin air, and we don't have to pay interest on it.
That is precisely right. And
so going to that, we've got the two types, just recapping, we've got the two types of money. We've got the money that the government prints, that's the sovereign money. And we've got the money from the private banks that's through this process of debt creation that you've got to pay interest for. And that's actually the money that most of us use to pay things like mortgage, get our mortgages, all that kind of thing with the private banks. But there's not the third kind of money, which they have in America, which is the money that's actually backed by backed by gold, because a lot of people have this image in their heads is that there's actually bank vaults with money in it, and that's not true at all.
I did not think there was any money in America backed by gold, Victoria. I think that went out with Nixon, didn't it?
It is. So that's just something that we imagine, that people imagine, but it's not really. It's all about.
Oh no!
It's all created money. It's just whether it's created by governments or whether it's created by by private companies.
And this brings me to the point: money is supposed to serve us rather than us serve money. So money is to enable our country and our economy to thrive, and for people to be able to trade amongst ourselves. And in so many ways, if there is things that need to be done and people without jobs, and there is a recession, those three things say that the missing part of that equation is money. The government's job is to fill that gap, and there is no reason we need to pay interest on New Zealand's sovereign money supply.
Now that's where we get into the thing that we started our conversation with Geoff. We were talking about managing crises. And I said to Geoff, what about the global financial crisis? That was the big one. And, a lot of people are still reeling from that. And it seems to me, Amanda, what you're saying is that there are alternative solutions from just the tighten your belt and, that whole argument, there is no other choice. We've got to put up with things.
Yeah, there is there is an aspect of this that relates to history, and that is with the Great Depression, both in the United States and in New Zealand, where in the United States, President Roosevelt brought in this New Deal and managed to get millions of people off unemployment and back to work, and creating tremendous infrastructure projects. And in New Zealand, we had a similar thing a couple of years later. Was this sovereign money? Like, where did the money come from to do all those things, to employ millions of people?
Okay, I think you're talking about the first Labour government in 1935. Yes, and that's a really important point, Geoff. So in 1936, what they started doing was using sovereign money. So this has been done before in New Zealand, using sovereign money to build a large amount of state houses. They also used it for some other parts of the economy, like guaranteeing agricultural prices and things as well, which was good. And they they provided a mass amount of jobs and a massive amount of housing. I think at that time, I think there were 27,000 houses that were in desperate need of repair and 10,000 carpenters unemployed. Of course, we had a recession at the time. Now, the definition of a recession is not enough money in the economy relative to the goods and the services, plus you've got unemployment and things that need doing. So they put the money into the economy. Did they get massive hyperinflation? No, they did not. I think they put in something like 5% of what the GDP was, and the GDP went up by 30%. Plus, you decreased unemployment, and plus people obviously got estate houses and improved quality of living. So there's certainly examples in history where this has worked well. I mean, it doesn't have to go like Zimbabwe every time or Weimar Germany every time.
So is that the argument why they don't do the sovereign money? Is why that the government doesn't or leaves the responsibility to the banks, to the private banks, instead of taking responsibility for the amount of money in our economic system?
Well, I think that's an excuse. I think it's an excuse, and I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, but I honestly think there's a lot of vested interests wanting the banks to keep the ability to be the only ones issuing a nation's money supply. And I don't know enough about that. That's very clandestine works. It seems common sense to me. We've got examples in history how it's worked. But for example, after the Christchurch earthquake, Jerry Brownlee was asked, well, why don't we issue some money to help repair Christchurch? Oh, he said, we don't want to go down that track. So we got no real tangible answers. We just got a blanket no. So it has worked before, and it can work again.
Okay, this brings to mind what I was reading about the history of New Zealand in the 1930s, again, with the Labour government that came in 1935 and state housing in 36 and so on, that in all of what I read, there was no mention of banks, that it was the government who was lending money to private buyers of property. They would borrow money from the government, and the government would charge 2 or 3% interest per year. But it was state advances. They created a corporation, State Advances Corporation, and it was so people were borrowing from the government, not from banks. Banks were not involved back then. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, but it wasn't just state advances, was it? You had credit unions, you had this post office savings bank. There was a lot of different outfits, but it was all a savings and loan scheme. It wasn't creating money out of thin air like private banks do now. And the interesting thing is back then that the commercial private banks, 90% of their lending was to businesses. So, of course, the businesses were able to get more loans more easily. So it was easier for the productive part of the economy to thrive as well. But now, of course, they've got monopoly on the lending. Most of their loans is to real estate because it's a really safe investment for them. And that's what this private neoliberalism is all about, really.
So it used to be, the only people who had the vaults full of money were the Americans. They stopped having the vaults full of money, some 40 years ago. So since then, it's all been somebody's creating the money, either government, it's sovereign money, or private banks, in which case it's this creation of debt, and it sort of seems to me that seems like, when did the banks get to be the ones who got to create money? Because I can understand why a government might create money. You've got the resources of a country behind it. But private banks exist to make money for their shareholders. So it's like how come the government is not doing the creating more money if the economy needs it? I'm not suggesting that they don't back it with things. Like I know when good policy is never borrow more than you can pay back if you had to, if you had sold all your assets. So no one's advocating creating such a lot of debt that you can't possibly pay it back. But it doesn't make much sense to me.
Well, no. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. But there's two aspects to it, Victoria. You know, there's the government issuing money for the public, and then there is the banks only allowed to lend out, you know, what their deposits are. And so they're two very different things we need to distinguish. The only way the banks would be able to lend to private people was to have the money first. So all of the money would then have to be issued by the government. And really, I guess what I want to push today is the first step in this sort of major step in changing the way money works would have to be public money issued by the government. And that's... Then what happens is that they can spend it into the economy through infrastructure, which is directly into the economy, or they can, you can do whatever you want with it. I mean, some people say helicopter money, everybody gets a citizen's dividend, you know, everybody's got their opinions on that, or you could, you know, you build the schools and the hospitals and the roads, or you simply give it to the banks to enable them, or lend it to the banks for them to be able to on-lend as they see fit to businesses. I mean, that's really, that's detail, but that would have to be how the money gets into the money supply if you're going to have a full sovereign money system. I would like to see it start with public money in terms of not having public debt, just eliminating this, the New Zealand debt.
Question for you, Amanda. Let's suppose you were the Prime Minister and you had the support of your party and you had the power to implement sovereign money. What would be the steps? How would you go about it?
Well, what we would need to do is talk to the Reserve Bank about how it would be implemented, because I think it's very important that governments don't have a free printing press, because that is when you do get all sorts of situations where all their election promises can just cause hyperinflation. It has to be an accountable, transparent system in a public body. So that would be put in the hands of the Reserve Bank. So the Reserve Bank, democratic, accountable, transparent body, would be determining from all the social indicators and all the statistics available to them how much money that was necessary to have a functioning economy at optimal levels. And they would then give that money to the government of the day, the elected government of the day, to democratically decide how that money was spent. And so ideally that would be a full sovereign money system. And at the same time, I would be paying off our public debt, certainly not borrowing anymore.
Okay, our sovereign debt is pretty massive, as you mentioned. But I've heard different figures, 80 billion, even 100 billion. I guess there's different figures for describing it in different ways. How could we ever pay that off?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I personally don't see that as a very easy thing to do. So the public debt's $77 billion, but if we add the public and the private debt in New Zealand, which really is what our debt is, it's something like $411 billion now. Of course, a lot of that's gone into housing, but it's still debt, and it's still debt that ultimately sits with every person in our economy, because the interest on that debt's tagged to all our goods and services everywhere. So, what was the question? How do we address that? I don't think so. The debt to GDP ratio now, what is it? It's 1.7 to 1.8 debt to GDP. It depends on the interest rate, depends on the cost of money. And at the cost of money at the moment, my belief is that actually we're past the point of no return. See, a lot of people just talk about public debt, and our public debt to GDP ratio is in a very healthy range according to the OECD. You know, it's 38% or something. So yes, but I just don't think it's the full picture. You've got to look at the entire debt across the entire economy, because otherwise the productive economy right at the bottom, who's struggling away with all these high debt levels, can't manage to fund the high public debt that we've got. it's all opinion, Geoff. I don't see it's very feasible at the moment. I just think we're getting ourselves into a debt trap.
Okay.
So Amanda, that because is what you're saying, that because the government of the day is not taking a more proactive stand on controlling money, we're actually just getting more in debt?
We are getting more in debt. We are getting more and more in debt.
And it's not debt using our assets, our national assets. It's debt to private businesses.
Our public debt is to private banks, and the private debt is to banks as well, predominantly. So, and they use our, for example, the public debt, they use the fact that they've got the taxpayer as security, and the public debt is they've got all our property as security. I mean, they're onto a really good wicket that the banks are on here. I mean, the guy from the IMF was saying, it's a privilege that only the banking industry's got to issue money like this with our security and charge interest on it. I mean, you've got to look at it in perspective, what they've got here.
Yeah.
So, no, I'm not saying that they're private businesses. They need to make a profit. But, this year it was something like $5-point-something billion profit. I mean, we've just got to be a little bit realistic about, what they should be able to do. Yeah.
Okay, so what about gold? It used to be, as Victoria was mentioning before, that money was backed by gold and silver. In the United States, it was more silver than gold. And in 1971, it was President Nixon put an end to that. Where prior to that time,
I didn't realise it was so long ago. I did actually know, Amanda, that they didn't have those reserves anymore. It's more just the image people have in their minds. But it was, back in 71. That's that's really, nearly 50 years ago.
Well, yes, the United States got into financial trouble, and they could no longer afford to be redeeming their debts with gold, and so they just simply made the decision by President Nixon that they were no longer going to do that. And then you've also got the matter of the Fort Knox supposedly has some massive amount of gold, but yet they won't allow it to be audited. So there was, there are many who believe that there is actually no gold there, as you were saying. That's your belief too, I believe.
Well, yeah.
In Fort Knox,
No, I don't know anything about Fort Knox, actually, to be honest.
Well, what I do want to do a bit of a tribute to the Pike River miners, because of course everybody knows it's just over 6 years now. But before then, just any last points that you'd like to make, Amanda?
I would. They did a survey in England, and only 1 in 10 politicians actually understood how their own money supply came into being. And they also interviewed the people, and I think it was more people than politicians actually understood how the money came into existence. And 60% of the people did not want private banks issuing their money. I think 20 or 30% had absolutely no idea how to answer the question, and this very small percentage said leave it as it is. So there's something interesting for you.
Yeah, that is interesting. Well, I certainly know more now. I knew about the money creation, but I didn't realise that there was quite so much money creation in the hands of private business.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Amanda, for coming in.
Oh, you're welcome. Pleased to be here.
Yeah, well, you've been listening to Educating for Social Change on Wellington Access Radio.